I would like to introduce one of my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Todd Shaw, who has been on the faculty since 2003 and has appointments both in USC's Department of Political Science and African American Studies program. He was appointed the College of Arts and Science Distinguished Associate Professor for Political Science and African American Studies by the then Dean Mary Ann Fitzpatrick. That was in August 2012. And in his stay since 2003, he has been very instrumental. In fact, he has a new appointment now as a Cato officer, the officer for the College of Arts and Science. And if there's anything else he wants to share with us, he will do so as I yield him the mic. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Todd Shaw.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Carnes, and thank you, Xavier, and thank you for all who are engaged in this process of thinking through cultural competency, and particularly my thanks again to CTE leadership and staff for this invitation, and good afternoon to all of you. I see many familiar names, and I'm really looking forward to having an engaging session with you. Dr. Nicole Cook sends her apologies that she's not able to join us today. And so I hope to make this presentation a great one, but it will only be at least half as great because she was not able to join me. But she did contribute to this presentation. She and I had a long talk. And so I'm delivering the accumulated knowledge of herself and myself on this topic. And so her presence is very much still here, even though she's having to be elsewhere in terms of giving a presentation. Okay, so I want to get into our topic of cultural competency and politics. Can we talk? And so you and I, as instructors, as administrators, as staff members, as students, we encounter all types of situations where we have to talk about difficult things, or there are difficult questions on our mind or on the minds of the communities to which we belong, and quite frankly on the minds of various individuals in the nation. And so how do we talk through these difficult things? How do we have these difficult conversations? For instance, we all very well know what occurred this past spring with the police deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, who were both killed by police in 2020. And you're all quite aware of the Black Lives Matter mobilization that occurred as a result. The New York Times and other groups sort of documented that conceivably the Black Lives Matter mobilization was the largest social movement or political movement in numbers that we've seen in a while, if not ever, if it wasn't the largest period. Maybe some 26 million people from various walks of life were engaged in that movement. Very multicultural, very global, but it no doubt spurred a lot of difficult conversations about questions of race, about questions of police brutality, of questions of racial justice, of social equity, of economic justice. There were a lot of things under the umbrella of what it sparked. So how do we have those conversations in a very diverse and plural American society, but one that is still that's pitted within inequalities, or that inequalities undergird so much of our political and social structures? So that's one set of difficult conversations to be had, right? Another set of difficult conversations you and I are also quite aware of, the insurrection at the Capitol. And I don't think it's partisan to call it an insurrection, since it was an effort to effectively in January, on January 6, 2021, which will be a date seared in the American memory. The group of protesters turned insurrectionists who effectively tried to, on the words of the President of the United States, overturn the results of an election, to challenge the constitutional process that Congress is charged with counting and certifying the electoral outcome of the electoral college. And so trying to stop the vote, as they said, from the standpoint of saying stop the steal, right? You know that 5 people were killed, that some of the grievances most certainly were rooted in conspiracy theory, and groups such as QAnon, the Boogaloo Boys, the Proud Boys, sort of various white nationalist and white supremacist groups, along with others on the far right and other political extremists. So given this has gone on, how do we have that difficult conversation about what's going on? And so yet another set of difficult conversations to have. So what I want to do is, what I want to do is lay the groundwork for having difficult conversations through the lens of cultural competency. Because another sort of way in which this difficult conversation or another sort of set of considerations for us to have, and yet another difficult conversation to have, comes from comes from Joe Biden, who is now the President of the United States. And we certainly can compare what he has said on these questions and on these questions of race as compared to Donald Trump. But let me just pull a couple of quotes from Biden's inaugural address that he gave just this week. In one quote, he says, "The cry for survival comes from the planet itself, a cry that can't be any more desperate or any more clear. And now a rise of political extremism, white supremacy, domestic terrorism that we confront and we will defeat." And it's an interesting development that you have a president of the United States use the term white supremacy within an inaugural address. He also says, "I know speaking of unity can sound to some like a foolish fantasy these days. I know the forces that divide us are so deep and they are real. But I also know they are not new. Our history has been a constant struggle between the American ideal that we're all created equal and the harsh, ugly reality that racism, nativism, fear, demonization have long torn us apart. The battle is perennial and victory is never assured." Again, we can stress the many sort of points of social and political and economic upheaval that President Biden is stating in his inaugural address. But again, he certainly does call out things such as nativism and racism in this address. And then lastly, he says, "Folks, this is a time of testing. We face an attack on our democracy and on truth, a raging virus, growing inequity, the sting of systemic racism, a climate in crisis, America's role in the world. Any one of these would be enough to challenge us in profound ways, but the fact is we face them all at once, presenting this nation with one of the gravest responsibilities we've had. Now we're going to be tested. Are we going to step up? All of us. It's time for boldness, for there is so much to do, and this is certain, I promise you, we will be judged, you and I, by how we resolve these cascading crises of our era. How do we begin to call for unity? How do we begin to resolve these crises if we cannot talk, if we cannot dialogue, if we cannot engage, and if we cannot use a certain lens or expand our lenses to understand these others that we must engage or others we should choose to engage with in having these difficult conversations? Okay, so I hope I've whet your appetite. You're here already, so I don't think I had to convince you a lot. But I hope I've whetted your appetite about how do we have these tools to have difficult conversations. So now let me go to our exercise, and I'm going to explain the exercise first and walk through it so that everyone sort of knows what we're doing in this role-playing exercise. This dialogue is all about the exercise, or the exercise is all about the dialogue and what we learn from these difficult forms of dialogue. Now, the example I use for this question of really cultural empathy really is what I try to stress. And I've used this particular exercise in my classes. It's one I devised after going through a wonderful collaboration. And by the way, as Nate Carnes has said, I'm the interim associate dean for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the College of Arts and Sciences. And one of the programs that I have the great privilege to work with Jennifer Gunter in presenting to the campus is the Collaborative on Race and the Welcome Table exercise. And so we can tell you more about the Welcome Table, and you can certainly go to the College of Arts and Sciences Diversity, Equity, Inclusion page. But the Welcome Table spurred my thinking about this. So here's the exercise. So the scenario is early one evening, when you're alone, taking a walk in a park, you encounter a flying saucer that hovers over you and beams you up. Okay, so that scenario of being beamed up by a flying saucer, being abducted by aliens. Now, it's a murky experience, but when you are returned, you try to convince others that the two small puncture wounds on your forehead are where aliens tapped into your brain. Okay? By the way, I use this exercise in a class called Race and Science Fiction. Okay. And so you've been abducted, you have two puncture wounds in your forehead, and you're trying to convince others, I've been abducted by aliens, see, this is where they probed my brain. Now, by way of a Zoom conference, you're going to try and convince your fellow role players that this happened to you. So one role player is going to be the ally, another will be the skeptic, and the other will be opponents. Now, it seems that the aliens are only visible to those they abduct, okay? So that's role player number one. Role player number one, which in this exercise I label the victim, the person who was abducted. Role player number two is the ally. Now you see the puncture wounds and you believe the abductee because you firmly believe aliens exist. Even though you've never had an alien encounter. So you've never encountered this, but you believe Carl Sagan when he says, well, it would be an awful waste of space for human beings to be the only sentient creatures in the universe. So it must be out there somewhere. I've never seen them, but yeah, it's possible that my friend was abducted by aliens. Number three, that's the ally. Number three is the skeptic. The skeptic, you see the puncture wounds and you want to believe your friend, but it is after all, a fantastic story. And there are other more plausible stories, right? You can think of other more plausible reasons as to why your friend has those puncture wounds, okay? That's the skeptic. Then the opponent, you see the puncture wounds and absolutely do not believe the inductee. You think she or he is experiencing trauma and need counseling given all the crazy things that are going on, okay? So the opponent takes a hardline stance of, no, couldn't have happened, but you're my friend. I think you do need to look into, seeing what really troubles you. Role number one, the victim. Role number two, the ally. Role number three, the skeptic. And role number four, the opponent. Okay? All right, so, yeah. Thank you so very much for your indulgence of that exercise. I know that might have been a little difficult given how we were trying to do this, but you can get some idea about the flavor of the exercise. Okay, so let's just walk through some discussion questions, and then I'm going to get through the remainder of our presentation. Okay, so feel free, to raise your hand or just say it out loud or type it in the chat. How did you, the victim, feel trying to convince your fellow role players that you were abducted by aliens? How did you feel playing that role? I got defensive very quickly, Danny said. Okay, all right. Not believed? Uh-huh. Caroline? Sad. Okay. Asserting my experiences felt real. Like I had to work very extra hard and provide a lot of detail, Alexandria said. Yeah. Victim was pretty convincing. Okay. Thank you. Appreciated having an ally. I began to question my own reality. Abigail, am I something wrong with me? Did I not feel what I was thinking? Okay, number two. How did okay, we kind of covered number one and number two. Let's go to number three. Um, Instead of an alien abduction, what concepts am I really talking about? What is this a good what are the types of things that are difficult conversations that this analog really might cover, as I suspect you might say? Victim blaming, racism and discrimination. It made me think about Me Too, right? Right. Oppression, marginalization, microaggression, sexism, abuse, racism, discrimination based on race, religion, caste, all of the above. Yeah, trying to get people who have not had my experience to believe my experience. Women not being believed as a standard. You are absolutely right, good folks. So this exercise is about cultural empathy, social empathy, about trying to figure out what does it mean not to be believed, and these various positions of not being believed, but also seeing, connecting to others when they've had these experiences of victimization. Number four and number five, I'll read together. How does it feel playing the role of being labeled a victim? So I came in and labeled you victim, ally, skeptic, or opponent. How does it feel for those roles to be imposed upon you as opposed to you deciding what role to play? Then secondly, feel free to put in the chat box, when you already know or presume you know the role other individuals are playing, does it feel pointless to try to convince them? So you already knew who was the skeptic or the opponent. Did it feel a little pointless to try even have them come over to your side? So what are your reactions in the sense of being labeled and trying to convince others? What are your thoughts? No choice in my experience or perspective. Disempowered. Difficult to act, right? Okay, so that's the other side, Rajat, is it a role that I even identified with? Or was the label being placed upon me one where I felt I had to play this role? Roles often blur, and so it was hard to maintain a purist stance, right? Jennifer, thank you. Frustrating, like I was wasting my energy on the skeptic. I didn't love being labeled. I wanted to choose, but we were role playing, right? These were the broader roles that we were given, right? Hopeless. We'll do number 6 and 7. In real life, isn't it possible for individuals to play multiple roles at once? And in fact, I think you've already brought that up, right? This idea of intersectionality. One can be both a victim and a skeptic, right? Uncertain about judgment from people on the other side, yet hopeless. So is it possible to play more than one role? And then 7, and this is what I call the bake your noodle question. I'm borrowing from the Matrix, the Oracle in the Matrix. Is it a disservice to use aliens in this scenario when racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, and other forms of discrimination are real? So, but why call it an alien abduction exercise, Shaw, if these various isms are real, or discriminations that people actually feel? Using aliens allows us to abstract and look at the problem with fresh eyes. Thank you, James. Yeah. Other thoughts about using the alien scenario? Does it work, or does it abstract too much? Yes, people and situations are usually quite complex. I don't think it's a disservice because it removes us from the political or social context, right? John, there's no risk, right? And in some ways, Carmen, John, and James, you're hinting at the last question, which is question number 8. How less effective would it be? And thank you, Abigail, and keep typing about the responses to the other questions. How less effective would it be if Shaw said, we're going to play the racism exercise? So how defensive would people be up front? Abigail, in response to other questions, people get defensive about their own biases and prejudice regarding the isms. Emily, take some of the defensiveness of discussion of these emotion-laden topics. And then Jennifer's, Susan Lepselter has actually studied real white working class self-help groups who argue that they have been abducted by aliens, right? Carly, I think it's interesting because you're probably going to be in a different role when it comes to aliens versus racism, right? So anyway, I hope that this exercise, and I'm gonna get through the other parts of the presentation, but I hope this exercise kind of at least gives you some insights about this broader notion of empathy and how we might be able to use these exercises in various settings to have people look through fresh lenses of empathy and cultural connection. And so let's talk about the precursors to cultural competence. We need, and before we can get there, we need to recognize and admit that our society suffers from biases, according to Gada. Suffers from biases, stereotypes, prejudices, racism, and institutional racism. It is not something we need to feel guilty about, nor should we be held responsible for the situations as long as we're working to end these injustices. We're not always responsible for the labels placed upon us, right? But we've got to recognize what turn it around and see what the label actually says. And what's the value, and since I'm a political scientist, or social or political power conveyed in that label or not conveyed in that label. And so how do we break that apart, break these pre-existing biases, stereotypes, prejudices, and roles that are all part of a broader structure apart, and challenge them. So let me just play a short clip on empathy. And you have probably made use of this clip or seen it in other instances, but I think this very short clip, and thank you again, Dr. Cook, really quite good about talking about empathy.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
All righty. Okay, we'll go back to the presentation. All right, so empathy versus sympathy. Know and live the difference. All right. So a moment ago, I asked you about that question of being able to play more role. And I'm quite certain all of you know, and some of you teach and research this question of intersectionality, of ways in which we have overlapping identities, of which are all connected to larger social structure, as Kimberly Crenshaw and many other scholars and activists have spoken about. And so cultural competence works in tandem with understanding our own intersectionality, something within us that we can connect with the other person, even when these sort of big social constructs, race, genders, sexual orientation, class, even with these big social constructs, these big labels, seem as though they don't seem to connect. What is it within us? What can we recognize beyond those labels that's a shared understanding? And in some ways, that requires you to be in community with someone, right? To be able to understand more of their story, to see what part of their story connects with your own. And I know you all sort of heard of, or may have heard of, this notion. Now, I won't play the clip, but I'll be happy to forward on the sort of clip that Dr. Cole has used in her class quite a bit, talking about sort of the privilege walk, right? Of sort of you have a group of individuals. First of all, they have to be in community enough to share some sense of sympathy or empathy with each other. That's important. Because when you ask the various questions that have individuals step forward, do you have more than 50 books in your home? Did your family have the opportunity to take a trip overseas? So sort of ask these various questions that are privileged that we don't even think about. And who is left behind, or how are individuals staggered throughout that distribution once you ask those questions of privilege? It can be very powerful, but it's powerful when we connect to the fact that I've left my friends behind, or there are certain individuals who care about me, but they recognize the fact that they're way ahead. And it had nothing to do with, it had all to do with the sort of these constructs or labels that they had these advantages or disadvantages. So let's get into cultural competence, and then I'm going to leave at least a few minutes for questions. So cultural competence is more than being respectful of the cultures represented in the service or even the community. It's more than awareness of cultural differences, right? More than knowledge of the customs and values of those different to our of those differences relative to our own. I've had the great pleasure of writing a piece in the religious theory journal of Cross Currents, where I talked about the notion of being more than an ally. Is it possible to be more of an ally in this sense of there's a concept that students of political psychology and social psychology in political science and sociology have used, common fate, of the belief that my well-being, my sense of my well-being, is connected to my perception of the well-being of this group, right? Do I have a common or linked fate? And is it possible to have a linked fate with a group to which you do not belong? Is it possible to have a linked fate to a group to which you not belong? Being more than an ally, more than knowing the difference, but really connecting. Cultural competence is the ability to understand, communicate with, and effectively interact with people across cultures. Cultural competence encompasses being aware of one's own worldview, knowing your own, what has shaped you, your own labels, developing positive attitudes toward cultural differences, gaining knowledge of different cultural practices and worldviews, and developing skills for communication and interaction across cultures. Then acquiring cultural competence. Acknowledge that we do not know as much about other people or communities as they know about themselves. Being aware enough to say, let me ask the pronunciation of your name. Being aware enough to say, how do you identify in this sense? How is, what is a respectful way to address you? What is important to you, rather than me assuming I know, Recognize our own and our own biases and our own community's biases. What are the lenses that go with the labels? What are the worldviews we're expected to have or that we do share, whether we recognize it or not? How can we open ourselves up to learn about and from other people in other communities? And certainly that includes your students. How can we keep a space open, particularly within our own thinking, with regards to the rich experiences that students bring, that they are not blank slates, but they bring their own experiences as well? And how can we work to develop a trusting relationship with individuals and communities? And this is from Press et al., their work on providing health information to community members where they are. Then acquiring cultural competences, cultural competence also entails respect your students and community members as the primary source for defining needs and priorities. Their viewpoint, their standpoint, that is very important feminist theory concept, is important. And respecting their standpoint as a reflection of their needs, of their priorities. Increased sensitivity to alienating behaviors. Starting out the presumption that, okay, here's the answer to the question, leaving space open for the views that are articulated, as opposed to particularly, and this is very much a part of being a teacher, of saying, well, there's a right answer, so let me move you along into that right answer, versus that's a good answer. Let's continue to think. How do we think about the framework that attitudes must change to become less ethnocentric and biased? It is difficult to have cultural competence if I'm going to do it on my own terms, through my own lenses, through my own worldview, right? How do I expand my worldview, particularly those aspects that stop me from seeing the worldview of others? Then we've got to get into policies. Policies must change to become more flexible and culturally impartial. There's an argument made by Rothstein, as well as many others, that there is no race-neutral policy. There is no policy that is race-neutral. Is there any such thing as a gender-neutral policy? Do all policies have the kernels of ways in which they may advantage or disadvantage? And so can we think through the ways in which, do the hard work to think through those questions? Practices must become more congruent with cultures, and value diversity. Create an environment in which people feel safe to express culturally based values, perceptions, and experience. Have staff and leaders who reflect the community's cultural diversity, and partner with cultural organizations and institutions. Don't feel you have to do this work alone. So next steps, and let's do this by way of you chiming in with some responses. So tell me, what will you take from today's session into your next class or your next professional setting? What's your takeaway of what you might do next? Thank you, Bridget. I teach multicultural psychology. First time it's being offered at USCA, and there is so much of today's workshop that is relevant for that class. The alien abduction exercise was great. Thank you, Bridget. I take it as a small point of pedagogical pride that I came up with something that people find useful. Thank you, Wanda. I'm not sure what to do next. My biggest obstacle is that students seem unaware of their worldview and biases. So that's an excellent one, Wanda. And feel free to chime in response to Wanda about, well, how do I provide students with these lenses? I teach a contemporary controversies in the media class, highly relevant. I would particularly like to take the insight from the role-playing exercise. Allowing for the fact that people's experiences are true cannot be denied. You know, and Wanda, I think in some respects, leaving space for conversation, but thinking about these questions and tools up front might be helpful. The reason I use the alien abduction exercise is it lets students think about their own perspectives. And notice that you may not have noticed, but I try to assign these labels randomly. Just point to whoever's in that window and then let the dialogue flow from there. James says, allowing for the fact that people's experiences are true and cannot be denied. Sarah says, I teach from about implicit bias in the criminal justice system and think about alien induction exercise will work great. Thank you, Sarah. John, we discussed empathy as a part of studying DISC and flexing in business environments. I'll add some of the sympathy versus empathy insight that you covered. Thank you very much, John. Nate says the intersectionality PowerPoint slide really speaks to me. And then Sarah, especially because so many students truly don't believe implicit bias exists. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah. Thank you much. Let me go to a few more questions, but keep adding your comments to the chat window. So how are you? I'm not doing okay. I'm just good at pretending. You know what? Sometimes I think it's as simple as checking in with others, right? Sometimes this notion of cultural competence or empathy as a precursor to competence is simply asking people a question. I ask my students, "How are you doing?" And when this past class period, when a student said, "Are you doing?" I think I phrased it, "Are you doing okay?" And the response was by one student was, "Nope." I took note of that and I sent the student an email just saying, "Hey, I'm just checking in with you." Now, whether or not she felt comfortable going on at length, she gifted us with an honest answer, right? And she was made herself vulnerable enough for me as the instructor and the rest of the class to know, nope, I'm not doing okay. So at the very least, I need to chime in and just simply say, I'm here to listen, and there are others I can point you to who are here to listen, and that can be very very powerful. Jennifer said, all of what you've covered here is what we do in anthropology all the time. Absolutely right, Jennifer. But at the same time, social class privileges often complicate the degree to which we can grapple with these issues. And then Lee says, feel stuck, however, on how to teach these highly charged political issues per your opening example. What happens when students say, well, the protesters at the Capitol are doing the same thing as the Black Lives Matter protester? What you do is you leave space for that dialogue. What you do is, and I'm not giving you sort of the magic answers, as I'm sure you realize, good folks. But don't quite. I say to myself, Todd, don't be afraid of honest dialogue with parameters. Don't be afraid of going ahead and setting the ground rules for a civil discussion, but an open discussion. In fact, again, students are, as long as we equip them with the tools to listen to each other as well, right? So let me get to the next slide with being an ally even when it's inconvenient. It's a matter of consistency. So remember my notion of, I'll bring it back to my notion of linked fate, of how do you create a sense of linked fate with a community to which you do not belong. Well, I think it is about showing up. In what ways can you be allies even to students in your class, or in other settings? And it's not always, go back to that short but beautiful clip that spoke about this question of empathy. That it's not always about having the answers, or as it says, it's not always the responses. It is about the connection. And connection only comes with consistency. And connection only, and particularly connection comes in those moments when you want to kind of move on. You have something else, but a student brings up a comment in the context, and all of us may have been in that setting or have taught in that setting where a comment is said, and you kind of want to move on, but you see that they demonstrated a concern, a vulnerability, a fear that it would be best at this moment to go try and unpack. And in that moment, you're an ally to that student. And there are various ways in which we can think about being those allies, whether they be in in search committees, whether they be on activities in student programming. I mean, there's a range of examples we can think through, right? Let me leave open some time now for just open dialogue. If you want to maybe unmic yourself, feel free, or if you want to continue to post in the chat, particularly if you don't feel I covered the question, or if you want to add to a question being asked by one of the fellow participants here. Carly, can you empathize with people you don't agree with? Empathy doesn't equal approval, but allows you to open a space for discussion. Thank you, Carly. So it isn't about approval. In fact, to have that discussion and dialogue says in some respects, there's bound to be some of the views I don't agree with. But and there's bound to be disagreements. In fact, disagreement is to be expected, right? It's how you work through that disagreement. It's how you work through those views that and not always saying that agreement is in effect the object, right? But at the same time, you don't want to leave who's ever engaged in that that dialogue, that engagement, that discussion sort of less than, right? So how do you strike that balance between being okay with a disagreement, but then not having anyone feel less than? Lee, I fully admit one of my own biases is being tolerant of intolerance. Recognizing students are at different starting places, but keeping my other students safe. Does that make sense? I agree with you, Lee, but so did Alexandria. So Alexandria says that absolutely makes sense. In my classes, we talk about a lot of politically charged topics. And from the beginning of the semester, I encourage my students to listen generously. I like that, Alexandria. Listen generously to one another. I tell them that they may not agree with everything I say and vice versa, but I am legitimately interested in hearing what they have to say. When my students have expressed what I may consider problematic sentiments, I try to ask them follow-up questions to get at the roots of why they think the way they do. And then I encourage other students to respond to their peers by sharing their own viewpoint and experiences. It doesn't always work, but it does seem to help open up dialogue and provide greater agency to my students to teach their peers and advocates for their ideas. I like that a lot, Alexandria and Lee, that it is the engagement and the dialogue, and being mindful of the fact that I do speak with a certain label and level of authority as a teacher and instructor. And so if I say, well, I have a problem with that, that's different. That's a different realm of power and position than students engaging among each other, right? So sometimes it's leaving space for them. I often will pause, unless I feel there's something I really need to intervene in. I'll pause and let, I have a response, but they know I have a response. It's their response to each other, and that listen generously that's really good. There's this concept of the difference between calling out and calling in. Calling out versus calling in. Calling out, you're wrong, I disagree. We have a point of where we do not see eye to eye. Calling in, well, asking the question, well, why do you feel that way? Well, what's your perspective, or how did you come to that conclusion? Sometimes asking questions provides the person for the space, because intersectionality tells us their answer may be more complex than what appears at first. There may be other layers to what they're trying to get at here. And so being clear about what I'm hearing and understanding is key. Let's see. I see Carly. I love the idea of listening generously. It's really easy to love cancel culture, right? But we should meet people where they are, especially students, to help educate certain nuances of topics and bring them along with us. again, Alexandra offers, and thank you, Carly. There are great points. I borrow a technique from therapy by reflecting change talk. Change talk. Highlight and emphasize anything they say about wanting to learn more, wanting to grow more, wanting to become more open-minded. Oh, Loretta Ross. Ross. Thank you, Sarah. Loretta Ross. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions, folks? Any other questions or observations? Particularly if you said, I don't know where to go from here. Thank you. Sometimes people don't want to accept that people can be a skeptic about what they believe. As a skeptic, how do you encounter that? So how could you be skeptical? That's a good question. Let me step back and provide space for that response. You know, again, as a skeptic, how do you encounter that? How do you encounter that people don't want to accept that you can genuinely be a skeptic about something? What do you mean you believe that conspiracy theory? What do you think? What are tools you have found that are useful to lean into that response, or to provide a response? How do you leave room for the skeptic? Or if you don't mind me expanding that question, Sadipta, even the opponent. How do you leave room for the skeptic and the opponent? In this forum, I know. Go right ahead.
Yeah. So for example, some people are probably very prone to believe in like conspiracy theory, and you cannot actually disprove with any logic. But also, so at best you can say that I don't believe that, but that means there is a lot of tension that you have to believe this because this is true, and there is no like logic to encounter that one. So I mean, what could be the communication, or what could be the form of response that one could give at that point?
Well, I think part of what I would say is that Ross concept of calling in is to if you can resist the temptation to furrow your brow, because there's a difference between saying, why do you believe that, versus, well, why do you believe that? So if you can resist that temptation, maybe as opposed to assuming they have no logic, figure out if there's a logic involved. If you can, if they're, what are they using as their basis of facts? You know, and sometimes I know it's sort of in certain settings, there's a precursor that individuals might use as like, well, this is just my opinion. You know, this is just my opinion. So let me clear the floor for saying anything next. It's okay, because it's just my opinion. Well, you know, in community, communication, speech, all these things matter. And so any one opinion can have an impact, can have a ripple impact. Someone believes something that I dearly believe is not true, and actually saddens me or affects me because they hold that view. So what I would do, and what I'm going to continue to do in my class, is when setting those ground rules, is to say, let's not attack the individual. First of all, let's have a conversation about the statement, the assertion, right? And that's part of my ground rules, is to say, you know, that we're not going to attack individuals. We're going to critique, have debates about ideas. I think also what I do is I try to model various views. What I try to do is say, well, someone who you know is someone who is not a native born person of this country, here's my view. Or someone who is very much a conservative, here's my view. I try to, at times, sort of model a certain sense that I clear the floor for opinions of various views to be expressed. You know, well, you know, there are some who believe that the 2020 election was stolen. And here's the conclusion that they reach. So as a teacher particularly, I'm walking through what that logic might be. Now, that's not just, that also provides room for those who might hold some of those views to raise them, but it raises it, and so and in some ways, there's times in which I felt a little bit I find I find myself a little at ease, but there's times when students toward an end of a class have said, Dr. Shaw, I was never quite aware where you stood on X or Y. Not, and by that they were trying to say, I'm trying to pin you down as to your thinking on X or Y. And I particularly got this when I was teaching an American government class, and a student was each day would walk into class, he would have a Ronald Reagan, George Bush T-shirt on. So he was clearly identified as a Republican, or my assumption may be that he was identified as a Republican. Toward the end of the class, he said, Dr. Shaw, this is a great class. I wasn't always certain of your opinion, but I appreciate the fact that you articulated, left room for all opinions, right? And so he didn't feel less than, even though I know throughout the class there were times I said, now factually speaking, I'm just going to lay out the facts of the case, but your interpretation is another thing. And so I will say that one of the other things I say to my students is, I'm not trying to change your view, I'm trying to inform your view. Or another way I state it is, I'm not trying to tell you what to think, I'm just going to give you some things to think about. So I think if you can sort of lay the groundwork in the sense that, no, we're not all going to agree, but I'm going to lay the groundwork for an active discussion, as long as opinions and views don't make others in this class feel less than, that's very important. But again, as has been offered, we're going to generously listen and we're going to lean in. I mean, I think maybe give students the same set of techniques. So even when they're expressing these views, it will maybe it's the student who may believe, well, I know what you think, so I'm not going to express it, who you really do need to draw into the conversation, because that's exactly the person who needs to have some sense of engagement with others, or the engagement would be enriched, because whether or not I hold the view or not, okay, whether I hold the view the election was stolen, I'm a little closer to understanding why that view is there. And if I'm going to be about the project of convincing folk that, no, here's the principles I think are true, and here's where is democratic, I can't achieve it if I'm not leaving any space to really understand why they hold that view. So anyway, I hope I didn't go on it too much at length about that, but hopefully that's a little helpful about how to engage the skeptic in generous ways.